My name is Kayla Brennan, and I am the Education and Research Coordinator for the NACA office. We're so excited to have you today with Dr. Adam Peck to talk to us about analyzing and reporting data from our NACA Next tool. Just a couple of housekeeping tips for those of you who are new to our webinars. A couple of you are already familiar with the chat. That is defaulted to just send to panelists, so you can toggle that over to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're writing. We also have a Q&A function that allows you to submit questions anonymously if you would like, and we'll use that for questions, and then everything else can go in the chat. It'll help us monitor what's been answered and what hasn't. And at this time, I'm handing it over to Adam.
Terrific. Thank you, Kayla. I'm excited to get started on this webinar. Excited that so many folks are joining us. And so without gilding the lily too much, I'll jump right in. And let me start off with sort of a hypothetical question. So that question is, how many of you participating in today's webinar feel like you have a parent or a grandparent who could accurately describe what you do? Maybe a spouse, maybe children. You can feel free to respond in the chat box, but this is really more of a hypothetical question. So the second question is, how excited are most folks in the field of student activities about the concept of assessment? Well, many of us probably feel this way, right? In fact, for many, many years, I think a lot of folks have thought of assessment activity as something that separates them from students. It's something they have to close their door to do. If you work in an activities area like ours here on campus, and so it separates us from students. But my question is, could those two issues be related? Is our lack of enthusiasm as a field or a profession, is it what is driving the fact that we often don't feel very well understood? Now, maybe it's possible that all of you answered in the chat box that your grandparents could absolutely describe what you do. I know my experiences would be different in that my wife is aware that I work at a university, so she's got that. She knows pretty much where my office is. She could actually probably describe fairly well many of the aspects of my job. I've been serving as our interim vice president for the last 4 months, so I'm not entirely sure I could accurately describe my job. But I think we would agree that in higher education in general, but particularly in the field of student activities, our work is not always well understood. Oftentimes, what people observe from the outside is how much fun students are having when they're around us. They know that we put on bands and comedians and that there are balloon arches involved. They know that there are inflatables and wax hands and student organizations. And the fun, as I've written about in the past, is kind of a double-edged sword. It is the fun that draws students into their work with us, which we know is deeply meaningful and transformative for them. But it is also that fun that allows our casual critics to dismiss us. So in that vein, we really present this NACA Next tool. So some of you are likely already using NACA Next. And so the reason that you're attending this webinar is going to talk about how to take data out of NACA Next and use it to tell your story. That's a really important aspect of this presentation. Some of you may be becoming familiar with NACA Next for the first time. There are other webinars that I've done previously that can really give you a fulsome walk through the system, see how it works. But I invite you, if this is your first exposure to NACA Next, hang in there because, you know, as Stephen Covey likes to say, it's important to begin with the end in mind. It would be great for you to approach looking at NACA Next through the lens of how would I use the data that comes out of NACA Next. So I'll start off by saying that for many, many years, I've been an assessment nerd for a very long time, including during the period of time in which I really worked hands-on in the field of campus activities. And I was always asking myself the question, how should a student who's participating in our programs be different from a student who isn't? And so I found that a lot of times when I would put forward a presentation for the national convention or even at my regional convention, I would always try to think about that from a campus activities lens. And what I found was that it was very hard to find other folks who were as excited about assessment as I am. Truthfully, that hasn't gotten a whole lot better. But as I was serving on the team that eventually put together NACA Next, what we really thought was that this was an opportunity to take folks who are not that excited about assessment, or maybe who don't feel as expert as they would like to be in assessment, and give them good data that helps them tell their story. So some of the advantages of NACA Next are that it is formative assessment. What we mean by that is that it both educates and evaluates. So when a student goes through NACA Next, which is built upon the skills that employers desire most in a recent college graduate, although we'll talk about that in just a second, it both evaluates them on those skills, puts them in a range from beginner all the way to advanced, and then at the end targets specific resources that they could use in order to level up in their skill. So at the very least, NACA Next, even if, and I'm not suggesting we do this, but even if we never even evaluated the data, students would become more aware of these skills, they would become more salient to them, it would prompt them to think about ways in which they have developed these skills, and that would take us a pretty far way towards educating our students. You know, one of the mantras that I repeat very often is we have to stop treating student learning as if it's a small part of assessment. We have to treat assessment as if it's a small part of student learning. The student learning part is the most important part. So that's the thing that NACA Next does really quite well, is help students become aware of these skills. It's turnkey. That means it's all set up for you. Now, the flip side of that we'll talk about in a minute is that it's not terribly customizable. So I do think that future iterations of this will definitely focus on that, how we can really make sure that it meets the needs of all institutions. But on the benefit side, it's plug and play. From the moment you put a student in there and you hit the button, it will launch to your student, and from that point forward, NACA Next really takes over. Benchmarking, it provides a comparison between your individual students and the students who've taken this nationwide. Oftentimes when we do isolated assessment on our own campuses, it's really hard to answer the so what question. Well, you know, 3.74, the mean score was 3.74 out of 5 with regard to their communication skills. I don't know, is that good? Is that bad? You know, so being able to, at a glance, see this is the national comparative benchmark and this is where our students are, gives us some context for that. It produces quantitative data, so that helps make our learning measurable and again comparable because it's a benchmark, but it also produces qualitative data. And qualitative data can tell your story. I'll make this point a little bit finer going forward. But combining stories and data can have a powerful impact in helping people understand you. Stories are very powerful, and they're even more powerful when they're grounded by data. Here's a particularly compelling case. Here's proof that this case is not an isolated one. So putting those two things together can really have a powerful effect. Now let's talk about some of the challenges. So when we designed NACA Next, we knew that it was just NACA Next 1.0, that NACA Next 2.0 would have to be in the cards, and 3.0 and 4.0 and so forth, learning as we go. We set it up eventually, at the very beginning, we essentially set it up so that we could get a sense of whether or not people liked this concept, would use it, and I think we've been extremely happy with the number of schools that have adopted it. Obviously, we endeavor to grow that number. That also means that right now, it's still a little bit in the wild, wild west stage. So there are a lot of things we could do to improve it. For example, it's not easy right now to pair up pre-test results to post-test results, which is how a lot of folks want to use it. You can do it, but it's a manual process. I'm going to show you how to do that in the course of this presentation. But future iterations of this tool, I know, will have the ability to pair up pre-test and post-test data, not only for individual students, but also for groups. We really need a dashboard system that makes it very easy for us to see our data as a whole. It is hard to draw conclusions about isolated points of data, and so it's going to be really important for us going forward to put that in an easy-to-read dashboard that pulls everything together. We also want to be able to run reports off of that data, maybe customizable reports that could really help you prepare your assessment reports for the end of the year, so that there isn't sort of an edge that is the end of NACA Next, and then you have to leap to wherever you want to go from there. And then finally, the skills that we're currently using for the NACA Next tool were developed using the Job Outlook survey from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. They've since done some really good work in combining those into what they call their career readiness competencies. It's not subject to change from year to year depending on how employers answer the questions. It's a more stable list. It also would reduce the number of overall competencies, and so I am hopeful that future groups will also look at navigating to that. So with that being said, if you have a passion for working on this project and you'd like to be a part of the future of NACA Next, right now on the volunteer portal on the NACA site, so if you're looking at the NACA site along the top, click volunteers. All of the association's volunteer opportunities can be found there, but in particular, becoming a general member of the NACA Next Advisory Board is one of those options. You'll notice you have until May 10th, so you'll want to get right on that. So in terms of how do we take data that we gather using NACA Next and turn it into assessment that can tell our story? So I'm going to just focus on 4 approaches today. And I'm going to start easy, and I'm going to get more complex as we go. So some of you who are thinking, well, I only want the easy one, I'll jump off in about 10 minutes. I really hope you'll stay till we get to the really good stuff, because I want you to see all that is possible. Now, I understand that we probably have a broad range of schools on this webinar today. And so it is likely that if you are at a larger institution, you may think, oh my gosh, none of these manual approaches are going to work for me. I will also say that as you get to a larger institution, you're more likely to have a few folks like graduate assistants, people who can help you out. I've even used our student workers before to help us manually enter some of this data. It is not complex, it's just a little bit tedious. And I would say that there's not a lot of good data out there that really tells our story. I was working with a very large Midwestern institution that wanted to use NACA Next to assess student learning in their general student organizations. They have more than 1,200 of them. My suggestion was start with just those informal leadership positions. There's only a few of them in each organization, and it will give you the ability to kind of look broadly. Also, you could randomly sample different student organizations, which ones you want to measure in a given year. There are lots of ways to sort of target this until those resources that we really need become available. So the first one we're going to look at is benchmarking. So benchmarking, I mentioned I'm going to go from simple to more complex. Benchmarking is built right into the system, so we'll look at that. Pre-post assessment, this is what most folks seem to be doing. So we're going to look at how to turn NACA Next results into mean scores and standard deviation. Then pre-post using paired t-tests. So if you want to do a little bit of statistical analysis, I think paired t is a pretty good way to go. I'm going to show you how to do it using Microsoft Excel so that you don't have to learn SPSS just to do it. It's actually very simple and straightforward. And then finally, we're going to talk about the importance of qualitative assessment and how we can actually take those stories and leverage them to help people understand us, but then also turn those stories into data using a rubric. And I'm going to share with you a very easy to use rubric that can produce some meaningful results. So with that, let's jump right into benchmarking. So again, this one is not going to be much of a magic trick here. When you have a student complete the NACA Next tool, or if you as the advisor to it, which by the way, let me just say, there are a lot of good reasons to consider doing that. One of them is for the purposes of, say, assessment, where direct evidence of student learning may be highly desirable. If you evaluate your student leaders as an advisor, using this tool, again, as kind of an electronic rubric, what you will produce is direct evidence of student learning. So in case that distinction's lost on you, indirect evidence is when we ask students about their learning, which is when we ask a student to evaluate themselves using NACA Next. That will produce indirect evidence. It will also produce a little bit of direct evidence as well in terms of their qualitative responses to questions, because in many cases they'll have the ability to actually exhibit the qualities that we want to be able to measure in them. For example, we want to measure communication. We're going to ask them about their learning, and we could evaluate their communication skill in expressing that to us. There are other skills where the qualitative could also be used to create direct evidence. Now, direct evidence is when we're actually measuring a behavior. They actually have to exhibit the skill in order for us to measure that. So again, as the advisor, when I rate that, it's a little bit like grading an exam. Grading an exam is direct evidence. You either know the answer to the question or you don't. And so I'm actually seeing whether or not you know that. It'd be a lot different if I just asked you, hey, do you generally understand algebra? And you said yes. Then I could say, well, 86% recently said that they understood algebra. Well, we probably wouldn't want to put that in front of anybody. I know that as a parent of a 15 and 13-year-old child, I'm now realizing that I neither know algebra nor geometry. So, so far, advanced multivariate statistics has not come into play in the junior high school and high school curriculum. So maybe someday. Of course, by the time they get to it, the way they'll be teaching it will be totally different from anything that I know. So I know the parents out there on this feel me on that. So you will notice that the benchmarking is really built right into this. So in each one of these, we've got the student's individual score, which is in this first column. And so we can see this is the composite of each of the questions related to, for example, on this first line here, computer skills. So there's a number of questions that make up computer skills. And when it comes together, they average to 3.6, which is at the advanced level. And then you can see how they actually compare to the comparative benchmark. Now, I'm going to tell you, like a lot of the data in this presentation today, this data is fake. It is not anyone's actual data. This was actually from the pilot when we first started testing NACA Next. And so actually all of these differences, not all of them, but quite a few of them are actually incorrect. So if you actually take the program now, then you will, it will be correct. But this was in the early stages of that. So it gives you not only their score, but how it compares to the benchmark and whether it's above the benchmark or below the benchmark. This is one of the very simple ways I think we can report this data. We can show, just by creating a very simple table, now this is not created by NACA Next, this is where we make that leap to reporting our data. We can say this is the national benchmark for this score, and this is the percentage of our students who were at or above the benchmark. That's a very meaningful piece of data because you could look at something like computer skills. So in this list of completely made up data, computer skills is kind of one of the lower skills for us to be at or above benchmark. So you might ask yourself, is that important to us? Is one of the main things we want to teach a student participating in, say, the campus programming board, is it computer skills? If it is, you might ask yourself, how are we doing that now? And what could we do to do it better? You might also decide that's not what we really want to focus on. We're low in comparison to the national benchmark, but it's just not something we're even trying to do. In that case, you don't have to present that data. You don't have to put that forward. If there's let's say a big initiative on campus, actually, let's talk about writing and editing. A few years ago, Elon University developed their Writing Across the Co-Curriculum program, which I thought was really cool, where they were encouraging their student leaders to write and reflect about the things they were doing, and it was a wonderful way to get stories and data about what students were gaining. So let's say that you're Elon, and you look at the national benchmark, and then you see that 82% of your students are at or above the comparative benchmark. That's really great. And then also, what if you looked across time at trends? This is something you can do as you participate in NACA Next longer. You could actually look here, and this kind of got jumbled at the bottom here. Sorry, I think it's one of those formatting things. I'm trying to find which one is, anyway, let's say that this is just communication in general. And this is when you started doing Writing Across the Co-Curriculum, and this is this past year, you're able to show there's some movement in that. So again, this would only entail taking the data from this slide and then reporting out according to all of the skills that are on the left-hand side here. What are the trends with regard to what percentage are at or above the benchmark? And then you could look at those areas too where perhaps it slips just a little bit, like this one here, and ask yourself, why did these slip? Is it important that it slipped? Is there something we could do a little bit better? Now, the purpose of assessment is not just for accreditation, but do keep in mind that accreditors really love to see you acting on the data you collect. They call it closing the loop. So one of the things you're really going to be evaluated on, it really isn't often the effectiveness of your program, it's what you're doing about it. Sometimes people become fearful of having data that sort of demonstrates that they're not as effective as they could be. Really, the worst thing would be having data but doing nothing about it. So again, we've started off very, very simply. How do our students compare against the mean score, and what are the trends with regard to the percentage of them that are at or above the national average? So let's dig in and go just a little bit farther. So we know that pre-test, post-test is a wonderful way to look at how students are developing skills across time. And so oftentimes what we'll do is compare mean scores. So this actually, by the way, this should ignore that. Let's pretend this is the first score, and let's pretend this is the second score in the pre-post. You can see which areas it went up or down. Now, the reason that we want to involve the standard deviation here is that mean scores are really useless without standard deviation. So this is one of my pet peeves. So a standard deviation measures the spread of the data from the mean. So let's imagine for a moment we had two data sets, and they had 10 students in each of them. The first one, half of the scores on a Likert scale, 1 through 5, half of the scores are 1s and half of them are 5s. What would the mean score be? Let's go ahead and throw that out as a toss-up. If you get this right, Kayla will personally mail you a piece of candy. I'm just kidding. That's not really going to happen. What would be the mean score on a Likert scale 1 through 5? Half of the people said 1, half said 5. I see a few folks typing. Yes, by the way, I did just do this. I asked a math question in the middle of an NACA event. Now, if you wanted to know the appropriate width of a balloon arch, boy, this group would be right on it. So I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure someone's trying to answer this question. 3, it'd be 3, right? Half are 1s, half are 5s, mean score 3. And so that doesn't tell us anything if we compare it to another, another group of data. And in this one, everybody says 3. So what would the mean score be for that? It would also be 3. So I've got one group of people that all are probably saying some version of neutral. Do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you neither agree nor disagree? Do you disagree or do you strongly disagree? All these people said, I don't really agree or disagree. It's not even important to me. But the other group, half of them said, this is very important to me. And half of them said, this is not important to me at all. Would you agree that you would want to know that? So there's a large group of people that strongly disagree with the thing that you just said, indicating that it's pretty important to them. And so you wouldn't want to confuse those two. So the standard deviation, I think anytime you ever report a mean score, you really need to have a standard deviation on there so that we can tell. Now, what's the rule of thumb on standard deviation? How do we interpret it? Well, in general, you want that number to be less than 1 on a Likert scale. So you can see that with regard to computer skills, how much deviation is there between this particular group of students and between these two different groups of students? How much variance is there? And there's not a whole lot. So we could get a sense of these ones that are over 1, and there's more variance there. These ones that are approaching 1, certainly comparative to the rest of the group, they're a little bit higher as well. So I would really encourage you to consider standard deviation. So this is how we came up with those. This is just a simple Excel spreadsheet. As I think you know, you can do averages in Microsoft Excel. So we've got, with regard to computer skills, this is one group, and this is their reported means, or their reported mean scores for each of these skills. And then we essentially do a composite of the mean, and we determine that for this group of students, the mean score is 3.12, and standard deviation is well below 1. So it means that this group is actually pretty consistently around the mean. So this is a pretty good mean for them. This one over here, career planning, you can see that there's a lot of variation. Here's one student who's really high. Here's one student who's low. So there's a lot of variance in there, and that's why you get the larger standard deviation. So just reporting those pre-post mean scores or those composite mean scores for various skills could be a great way to tell your story. Boy, we're moving right along now. So let's talk about using paired t-tests for pre-test, post-test. So essentially, the first thing that I want to help you do, and we're going to work through this relatively quickly, but you may not realize, if you open your Microsoft Excel, you want to look and see if there is a data tab, which will only appear if you unlock that. It is in your system, but you actually have to unlock it. So if it's not on there, go into the drop-down menu, click on Info, and look for Options. You don't want to do this now, but if you want to know how to do this, one of the simplest ways is type in Unlock Data tab in Excel into YouTube, and you will find a bunch of videos on how to do this. So then we go into Add-ons or Add-ins, sorry, and then you look for the Analysis ToolPak. Hit Go. Make sure the box is checked for Analysis ToolPak, and then guess what? It opens up a whole possibility of statistical tests for you to very easily run from your Excel. So why a paired t-test? Why is that what I want to show you how to use? A paired t-test is used to compare two population means, where you have two samples in which observations in one sample can be paired with observations in the other. So in other words, we've got a group of people, they're at a certain baseline, then there's some sort of exposure to something that we expect would change that, then we measure it again. Now, the most frequently made mistake in a paired t-test is if not everyone who's represented in the first data set is represented in the second. It has to be the exact same group of people, or else it won't work. So it will give you a false result. So make sure that, you know, in general, this can be kind of hard to control, but because NACA next sets it up where you can see, here's a student and this is the date they took this one. Here's the same student, same name, and here's a later date at which they took this. It makes it very easy to pair up. So essentially, it is as simple as making a list of the scores from within NACA Next, which you can actually access. Well, let me pop ahead and we'll come back to this. When they take the NACA Next assessment, it's breaking those skills down into individual skills. And then there is a report at the end in which you can pair those up to the data. Now, my recommendation would be that you score these as it shows on the actual report. 5 for an expert, 4 for advanced, 3 for competent, 2 for developing, 1 for beginner. And then if someone marks not applicable, do not score it a 0. Just remove it from your data set because it will mess up your scores otherwise. So going back to here, we just make, we go through each one of those skills. We input the score into the spreadsheet. So we would do this one. This is the pre-test. This is the post-test. And then if you want, if you want at the end, you can run the mean score there. But you can also take one of these empty cells here and drop in paired t-test. It just pops up in your statistical package. And then it will produce, see, there you go. It will actually produce this report. Now, what do we want to look at on this report? Well, first of all, you'll notice that the mean scores are there. So here's the pre-test mean score. Here's the post-test mean score. So you would observe right away that with regard to this individual student, their composite mean score went down. That is not unusual, by the way. One of the most frequent things to happen in pre-test, post-test is that students overestimate their skill level in the pre-test and then they correct that in the post-test. I actually think that having a student's mean score go down with relationship to a skill is a really good sort of interval. And then if you can continue to measure them, so let's say we do fall one year, spring the following year, and then the next fall, you will typically see those mean scores go back up as students begin to actually develop their skills. So the part that you really want to analyze here is the p-value. So the p-value is related to the confidence interval. So you've probably heard this mentioned before. So the confidence interval, if you had, for instance, a confidence interval of 95%, that means plus 5%, minus 5%. We are pretty certain that we've got the correct statistic within plus or minus 5. You'll see that a lot during an election year. We think that this candidate is leading this candidate with a margin of error of plus or minus 2.5% actually in this case. So that's how you interpret the p-value as well. So the most important part to look at right here is these numbers here. If it is between 0.05 and 0, then you would reject the null hypothesis that there's no relationship between these two things. This actually establishes a pretty solid relationship between those two things. So something is going on, and that p-value helps us to confirm it. So it was not my intention to teach an entire class on statistics. My hope was that I would sort of get you started. And again, there's a lot of great training resources out there about that. But I think in terms of validating quantitative assessment of student learning on a pre-test, post-test, a paired t-test is a really great way to do it. So last thing we'll talk about before we go to questions and answers, is qualitative assessment. So I'll start from this perspective here. Sometimes people tend to think that qualitative assessment is less important or less trustworthy than quantitative assessment. And it may very well be that we were trained this way in our graduate programs, or maybe we work with a boss who really only wants to see quantitative assessment. One of the places that we get into trouble, I remember asking these questions of my advisor in my graduate program, and then now the students in my graduate program ask me this all the time, and I get to be the one to tell them. well, how many people do I need to interview for this to be trustworthy data? And you say, well, that isn't a qualitative question. A qualitative question, because qualitative research is not about applying what we learn to larger populations. In other words, needing a representative sample of that group in order to have the statistical power to make predictions about what might happen in the future. We don't care about any of that. The purpose of qualitative is not to predict, but to describe. So you could interview a group of 5 people, and if you could accurately describe how they felt about a certain phenomenon, you'd actually be doing some pretty good qualitative research. Now, if the purpose of that qualitative research was maybe to try to test it and see if what was true for this small group might be true for a larger group, you would need to use some quantitative means, and you might want to speak to more people just so that you get more information and you're better able to describe how they feel. So there really is purpose in qualitative assessment. And again, it's built right into NACA Next. I thought I'd mention this. By the way, all of this is quoted directly from Engagement and Employability, which came out in 2017. There was a study by Kouzes and Posner, many of us recognize them as the leadership theorists, which found that the engagement that resulted from hearing a story tended to keep a listener's interest more than just hearing data. And then Martin and Powers were able to confirm that, saying that when they looked at 4 different ways to persuade others, they looked at 1, tell a story. 2nd was use relevant and trustworthy data. 3rd was to use data and a story. And the final approach was to use a policy statement from a senior executive. What their research found was that stories alone were the most powerful. Now, to me, I still think that there is value in having data that validate our stories so that we're ready to go. So we certainly, data is still very important, but stories really tend to travel a little bit farther. So I mentioned before that at the conclusion of the student taking the self-evaluation, they'll actually receive a report which shows them what is your level in this particular skill, what is your score, what is the comparative benchmark. As you can see, this student is considerably above the national benchmark in this score, almost a full point. And then we share with them some resources. Here's some various things you could do if you wanted to advance the skill. I do want to mention that this particular student who completed this is a biology major who also works in the computer lab in the biology department. So this is a student who's very technically competent. And so you can look at this for all of the skills here. You can only see 4 of them here, but this is where their data can be found. This is where the difference can be found. By the way, you can cut and paste this right into an Excel file if you want to compile that. And again, it's a little bit tedious, but it's also it's quite easy to do. It would be easy for a graduate student or a student worker to understand how to go about doing that. So again, you'll notice that the qualitative data here really jumps out. So when I talk to students who've done the NACA Next assessment, what they often say to me is that this was the most useful part for them. They had to think about how they were actually putting this skill into practice. So verbal communication, how is this student who's participating clearly in Student Government Association, how are they able to use that skill? And it really makes them have to think about it, internalize it, and then articulate it to someone else. So one of the ways that we can report this data is for us to just simply take a look at each of the skills and what percentage of the students could actually provide a relevant example. So this is you sort of grading their test, and it does produce direct evidence of student learning. It would even get stronger if you had another person also rate it along with you and then saw what percentage of the time each one of you agreed. We call that inter-rater reliability. And it really takes qualitative data and it makes sure that, that it's not as subjective as sometimes qualitative data can be. So if you're looking for a rubric to look at skill development, I want to throw this out there. So this past fall, my colleague Dr. Michael Preston and myself released a new leadership model called the Co-Curricular Career Connections, or C3 leadership model. I'm really pleased to say that there are institutions all over the country that are adopting this model. If you are interested in it, you can simply type C3 and NACE, N-A-C-E, National Association for Colleges and Employers. We published it with them. If you type C3 NACE into Google, this will be your first hit. So one of the things that we did in this model was look at student skill development. Now, many of you have probably seen Bloom's taxonomy of learning that looks at the different levels, higher order, lower order learning. But there isn't a clear parallel in the area of skill development. It's certainly not one that we thought matched up with the work that we were doing. So we wanted to find a way to articulate what does the process, that hierarchical process of skill development look like in this context. So I promise I'll make this make sense in just a minute. First of all, you have to start with an awareness of the skill. If I had never seen fire juggling before, from the moment I see fire juggling, I might say, that's a skill I'd really like to acquire. So now I'm aware of it. Then I might see, I wonder if there's a class on fire juggling I could take. I wonder if someone I know knows how to fire juggle. By the way, if you're involved in NACA, the chances that you will know someone who knows how to fire juggle go up precipitously. So now I'm beginning to acquire the skill. So I go, they explain it to me, they show me a video about fire juggling, but I can't just leave then and go, oh, I guess I know how to fire juggle now. No, I'm going to have to actually do it, right? And so now I have to apply the skill that I'm gaining. Then next, I've got to figure out how to advance the skill. I know how to regular juggle. I don't know how to fire juggle. I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of dropping torches at the beginning. And so I'm going to have to keep practicing and practicing in order to get better. I might have to go back to my expert. I might have to find someone who's even better than they are and figure out how to get that skill from good to great to expert to the point where I'm teaching it to other people. And then finally, articulating the skill. Only once we really have a sense of our holistic skill development could we really tell others about how well we do that skill. If you don't believe that articulating is the last phase, think back about what we said about pre-post, where students overestimate their skills at the beginning, and then they realize as they go that they're not quite as good as they thought they were. That's why articulating goes last. So I think this could actually make an amazing rubric for evaluating the qualitative data that's found within NACA Next. When we look at the different things that a student says, so let's pop back to this student. The student wrote, my role in SGA requires that I be able to express views to people within the organization and to members of other organizations in an effective manner to, they say, express the goals of SGA, but I think probably they mean advance the goals of SGA or explain. So where would that go in terms of skill development? Well, certainly they're aware of the skill. It sounds like they've acquired the skill and applied the skill. I don't see much evidence of advancing. Articulating, probably not all the way there. I would probably put this student at the applying stage. And so you can actually see all of these definitions that are included here are actually in the C3 model if you look at them. And in some cases, a student may, and in fact, in quite a few cases, they may say, you know, with regard to the skill of, I can't remember what skill that was, I think it was verbal communication, I like it, it's good. You know, they might say something that's not useful. And in that case, you really can't observe. And that's its own kind of measure. Or maybe you put them down here at awareness. Again, you can rate these things, and then you can actually see if over time, do more, you know, what's the average level that a student is at with regard to this? If we look at our students holistically, what percentage of them are at the lower levels? What percentage of them are at the higher levels? Or in terms of pre-post, could you look at the way they explain it in the pre and then see if they level up in the post? So there's lots of ways to take this qualitative data, and then turn it into quantitative data. So I mentioned this. Here's a few different examples that we could go through and try to categorize with regard to these skill levels. So one person writes, I have used computer skills in my campus job, which is front desk student worker in the biology department for all of my classes. So this person is aware of computer skills, maybe at some level acquiring, maybe even low levels of applying. Here's a student. I created a survey to determine the path SGA should take in a potential name change. And the data was analyzed, I would say were analyzed, to determine the appropriate course of action. That is clearly a student who is applying that and maybe even moving beyond to advance. You know, this is a person who has to figure out how to interpret that data and use it to make decisions. This person, I used Microsoft Excel in the Student Government Association to track our members' office hours and have previously used it to track attendance. I use Excel just about every day since the Google form where the senators must submit their office hours gets sent to my phone. I try to update my Excel spreadsheets as soon as possible. I mean, this is a student who clearly has advanced with regard to the skill, and I would even say is able to articulate it. They don't just say, yeah, I use data. They said, this is how I use data. And then the last one, when I was a project leader for Freshman Leadership Academy, I was usually the leader who informed the class of our updates and any information we had to give to the students. Every Tuesday, I would stand up in front of 80 students, plus faculty and student assistants, to make sure they had all the information they needed in a clear and concise manner. Now, I happen to know who this student is, and I can tell you that they have always been a pretty good communicator, but this reflects a next level for me. So I don't want us to be too caught up in the fact that qualitative data can become quantitative if we want it to. I think what's better instead is to think about the people on your campus who might be most skeptical of the role that you play in teaching and learning. How hard would it be for them to deny that student learning is happening if they were confronted with this kind of evidence? And that kind of evidence can be found in abundance in NACA Next if you apply it with students learning on your campus. So with that, my intention was to leave about 10 minutes for questions, and it looks like we've done that. So if you have a question that you would like to answer, I'm sorry, if you want to answer it, that'd be even better. But if you have a question you'd like to pose, I would encourage you to throw it in the chat box, and I will do my best to answer them.
Hi, everyone. As Adam mentioned, go ahead and put those questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'll take it from either while we're waiting for some questions to come in. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us on the webinar today, and thank Adam for presenting it to us and giving us all this great information about how to use the data from NACA Next to tell your story. This webinar has been recorded, so if you'd like to refer back to it or share it with your colleagues, it will be in Encore, our digital library, in a few days, and everyone who registered will get an email as soon as it's ready, along with the slides from today as well.
And I'll throw this out there too. This is my contact information. If questions occur to you after we are finished for the day, feel free to reach out to me via email.
So we will just hang out for a couple minutes, see if any, oh, first question. Is NACA Next something that we can access now? So the answer to that is yes. It is available to all NACA members. It's under our resources tab. And like Adam mentioned, there's some great webinars that he's already done that have a very introductory view of NACA Next. And one of those is actually, if you launch the advisor dashboard on NACA Next and click the Getting Started button at the top, one of those webinars is linked on that page. But you can also search Encore for other NACA Next related resources.
Let me add too that this is a resource that is free, or at least included in your institutional membership. And it is not only able to be used by you, it could be used by other areas within, say, student affairs or at your institution. So oftentimes I'll speak to groups and they'll say, oh, I would love to get access to this. Maybe we'll join NACA. And I'll say, I imagine you're probably already a member of NACA. Contact the campus activities folks on your campus. In that way, it can kind of become a little bit of a resource that you can bring to bear to help other people out. So you'll see that in the NACA Next tool, it's very easy to set up multiple advisors, and you can set up as many as you want.
Yes, that's a great point. There should be a button at the bottom, or if you go to our Contact Us page, they'll put you in touch with our member relations folks. And to be an advisor at NACA Next, you have to be listed as a grad student, professional staff, or faculty member in our system. And then students are actually going to get a separate login that you'll create for them. And that's through like our students.naca.org page. So it's separate if your students already have a regular NACA login. It is separate from that. So that's one thing that can get a little confusing for the students, but that keeps it from having to create a NACA account for all of your students. And there's an option to bulk upload students as well, so you don't have to do it one by one. But great question.
Well, Kayla, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I'll just invite anyone again. If you want to reach out to me, my email is there. You could tweet me as well. And as a matter of fact, if you just enjoyed this, feel free to throw a tweet at me. It always makes me happy to see those. So with that being said, I know it is April in student affairs, and there are probably 14 fires that are burning right now that you'd like to get to. I appreciate the fact that you took advantage of this opportunity today. I wish you a great end of your semester, and really hope you'll consider adopting NACA Next coming up this fall.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And like I said, you'll get an email as soon as this is ready. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day and good luck with the rest of April.